conversation about native grains or high-yielding crops, because I don't think it's a binary question, really. I think we'll probably get to that point, but I think it'll be a nice conversation. Okay, thanks. And Rob, we'll get you to introduce yourselves. Yeah.
Thanks, Emma. This is going to be a ripper of a session to finish off the whole 2 days with. I think the topic around this hyper super yielding versus native grains, which are hyper super nutrient, and where we go in the future, because one's a perennial and the other one isn't, although there are perennial wheats coming into the mix, is such a fascinating topic, because it also touches on the other vexed issue that Emma touched on. You know, we're on ceded country. You know, in First Nations people had it for a long, long time, and there's a lot of wisdom and a lot of law that come out of that, and then we've got on layered on top of that the Crown when colonisation happened, and then on top of that we have freehold, which is not free to do what you bloody well like. It's free from the Crown. That's what it actually means. And so there's all sorts of layers that'll come out of this topic that will hopefully stimulate us for a lot longer. Apart from this, you know, to end the grounded conference, we've got to call it a conference rather than a festival, but it's been more of a festival of ideas, a festival of great minds coming together, and a festival of sort of really innovative, stimulative thinking. So as Emma said, we've got a small-scale grain mill. It was actually co-designed. It was a co-creative effort between Jack's father, Bruce Pascoe, and Ian and Courtney, or Ian Young, Ian Cognan and Courtney Young down at Berrigan. That's near you, isn't it? Yeah, Berrigan. They involved the whole town of Berrigan in building this flour mill. And then we got the Black Duck team over to help us design it so it could do native grains. And then we had a couple of fellas come down, and we threw all sorts of things through it to try and see what it does. And now a whole bunch of chefs at the Food Connect shed do lamandra, Mitchell grass, speargrass, all sorts of things, just in small quantities at the moment. And what they're experiencing in terms of flavours and textures, and just the pure experience and the excitement of mixing these in with wheats and rices has just been marvellous to see the chefs experimenting with them and taken away. But Jack, you want to tell us a bit about yourself, and we'll just go down the line and then we'll get the conversation started. And what we want to do is get to about 20 past or even 25 past, and then really move this session into a big Q&A, more of a conversation, and take it from there. So Jack, hand it to you, mate.
Thanks, Rob. This is the worst stage, by the way. I think I've tried most of them. This one makes you feel like you're going to fall over backwards. So I'm Jack Pascoe. I'm a Ewan fella and links to Tasmania. I guess relevant to this conversation, which I have no idea where this is going, fellas. I don't know. I haven't really thought about it a great deal either, so you guys can do the heavy lifting. Dad obviously wrote a book called Dark Emu, which actually funded a farm in the end. Well, Andrew Bolt funded a farm by ragging on it, effectively. But I guess the whole premise of establishing the organisation Black Duck was Black Duck Foods was to sort of explore some of the ideas of native foods in agricultural systems, and probably not traditional agricultural systems. And you know, Dad's he's a good talker. He's a good writer. He's not a great organiser, I think it's fair to say, Jim. Yeah, you know, he gets by. And so I sort of lent in and helped a little bit with the establishment of the company, and then realised a few years in that you try not to establish boards with your family. But no, I guess that's my role with Black Duck Foods. By trade, I'm a fire ecologist or a wildlife biologist or something. So I feel like I'm about to be in a debate where I know nothing about the enemy. So let's have a go.
My name is Matt Haggerty. As for my last name, I'm Ian and Di's son. I spend most of my time working on the family farm back home, Prospect in WA. We have about 65,000 acres. It's a mixed operation between cropping and livestock. So it's about put in probably 12,000 hectares of crop this year, and we run probably about 8,000 merino sheep as well. Our practice of farming, we've kind of called it natural intelligence farming, that mum and dad have developed over the last 23 years or so. And I spend most of my time on the cropping side. I love sheep, but they can piss me off a few times. So I spend most of my time, on the cropping side of things. And we at the moment we've got about 9 different varieties of wheat. We do barley, triticale, cereal rye. We do like multi-species cover crops. We do like some companion crops with like legumes and cereal rye, and trying all different types of things and see what type of results we can get. And things have been pretty good so far. And keen to continue the conversation.
I'm Stu Whytcross. I from a little town called Borellan, which is halfway between Sydney and Melbourne, and inland from Canberra, about 3 hours. It's right in the heart of Wiradjuri country. I'm a fourth generation farmer out there. I'm really passionate about agriculture and about my hometown, Borellan. Any chance I get, I'm always keen to kind of talk about my town. We're home of the big tennis racket, which is a bit of a tribute to Yvonne Goolagong, who was born and raised there. Pretty phenomenal achievement. Her winning Wimbledon at the age of 19, going away, having a family, coming back 10 years later and doing it again, and a lot of the farmers and our town work together to build that tennis racket and mount it up over the main street. Probably not to jump through a few obstacles to get past council to get that up there. But we also have a good old days festival there, where we every long weekend in October we go back to traditional farming practices, and every year try and break the record for the most amount of Clydesdale horses pulling a wagon. We're up to 36 now. And it's so sorry, anytime, like, come and visit. Come and visit. But to cut a long story short, in an attempt to try and create a bit of recognition for our town, we decided to start a non-for-profit organisation to create a beer that was made from grain that was grown in our town, and really try and promote that, just like wine, beer and spirits are an agricultural product. They start in the ground, they're grown by farmers. And that led us to starting a malt house, where we basically prepare the grain that's harvested from a field for breweries and distilleries. Essentially, we germinate the grain, we create sugar in that grain that then brewers and distillers can then create alcohol from that. That was about 10 years ago we started that, and we now supply about 500 breweries, distilleries around Australia. If you've had any of the beers down at the tent, the Stone and Wood NRB beer, or the Wildflower beer, or the Welcome Swallow beer, they all contain grains that we've malted. And what we discovered very early on is that I get two things: the farming practice and the climate and terroir and provenance has an impact on flavour, and the variety of grain has an impact on flavour. So the further back we've been able to go and resurrect some of these older varieties, they've actually been really popular in craft brewers and distillers who operate in a bit of a different space, where they're trying to create products that have got a lot of flavour and interesting, unique characteristics. It's been a whirlwind kind of 10 years from trying to start a little beer for our local community, to now supplying malts right around Australia, and also exporting into Japan. So we get to play around with native grains. We also get to play around with a lot of newer modern day variety grains. And most of our work kind of tends to be somewhere in the middle of that space.
Good stuff, Stu. Now, Jack, let's go straight into your pitch for native grains. What is a native grain? What's the advantages? Give us your best.
Yeah, okay. Look, I mean, native grains have been here and they belong here. right? You can't argue with that, can you, fellas? So I guess the thing that draws me to perennial native systems is the ability to maintain cover over the soil, to care for mother's skin, but it's also the ability to create soil, deep roots, and drag organic material into the soil. And it's a system that, although, you know, Terry's, I'm going to counter-argue my claim now. I mean, Terry's numbers this morning about, you know, rotational grazing figures and sequestration of soil carbon was quite extraordinary this morning. But I guess, for me, everything has its place, really. And one of the things that I think, I'm just going to go off pitch. So, like, one of the interesting things is we have a climate crisis and a biodiversity crisis. We've had a colonisation crisis, but we're moving on from that. But the climate crisis has entirely outstripped for coverage. I don't know why I'm speaking to you, Rob. The biodiversity crisis, and has got all of the attention. And it's kind of scary because you can't get out of the climate crisis without high levels of biodiversity. We know that. We know that forests around the world are now a net emitter of carbon dioxide. They're not being particularly well managed. And we also know that protected areas are losing biodiversity far quicker than agricultural systems, which is kind of extraordinary, different baseline. But I guess my pitch now, back to that, is that we still have systems that rely on very few species. And look, I appreciate regenerative agriculture and agroecology, as I'm learning this week, is obviously pushing diversity. But biodiverse systems are far more biodiverse than that. And so my pitch is there are a whole range of grains that are native to this country. They deal well with the soil, they deal well with the climate, that they are used to the practices of 60,000 years of human tenure, and a real opportunity to restore some of the biodiversity that we've lost elsewhere, and contribute to agricultural systems. And, you know, it'll take some work to manage the systems in a such that it can be... Oh, maybe we'll just skip that and go to a barter system, Jason, anyway, and we don't need to worry about commercial viability because, I love it. But, you know, the dollars and cents come into it, obviously. I mean, if anyone else started the day this morning with the definition of natural capital and then spent the rest of the morning crying, I'd like us to move a little way off that, because we can't think constantly about what's in it for us. That is such a human-centric and destructive way of dealing with the world. And I guess my pitch is native grains can help us do that, fellas.
Your pitch, man?
Yeah, no, I mean, I totally agree on the native grains. Us personally, we haven't done any planting of native grains. It's something that me and the folks have definitely had conversations about many times, and we'd love to trial it out and, grow some native grains because, it'd be brilliant to add that to the diversity of species that we're growing. And, the fact that you can get multiple potential harvests off some of them that are perennial, that'd be brilliant. Love that. At the moment, we're just, mainly those cereal varieties. Some are as old as 200 years old varieties. Some are, as young as 4-year-old varieties. What we've noticed, though, is through the Natural Intelligence Farming practices, and over time, the plants and the grains have kind of developed their own intelligence to be able to sense their own country. And by, supporting that through those, the microbial networks from the soil system and the fungal and bacterial networks, it's able to sense its own, the season. And we've watched it happen many times across this many years where the crop starts, the growth rate will completely change and you go, oh shit, what's going on here? All of a sudden a dry period will come and hit and things like that. And you go kind of like, holy shit, like these plants know the season ahead, now that they're in sync with the diverse network of ecosystems that's happening below the ground, they're really in touch with the whole system. So, and we've seen a lot of benefits come from that. So then hence the conversation, hyper yielding comes in. I'd probably like to change that from hyper yielding to optimum yielding. The species would grow to the optimum yield of what their potential is and what the season allows it for. And what we've noticed, that has ended up being very still competitive yields against the industrialized system. Like this year, for example, our crops have really sensed how the year had worked, and with the resilience within the landscape, we had to push through. We had an extremely dry start to the season. We had a false start as well. Started seeding in March, which is pretty typical for us. Had a germination rain of 13 mil, germinated those crops that we'd already seeded by then, and then came out with another 5 or 6 weeks of 35 degrees, just hot as hell. And yeah, they didn't like that one little bit. And yeah, we kind of thought that a few of them might be a little bit screwed, like, shit, this is definitely pushing the letter here a little bit. Thankfully, it came into, July and rain started coming in, and they, really held on in that time and started growing then. And then it came through, had a very short and sharp season through July, June and August. And once September hit, the tap turned off again, had an extremely dry finish, especially September times at a critical point in the grain fill of the head. And we were having a look around, and a lot of the farmers around us, their crops were pinching off, getting a lot of small grain quality was reducing, and they weren't feeling their potential when it comes to yield. But with the whole ecosystem working in harmony with each other, the plants had a massive water holding capacity they were able to tap into, and really push through to that dry finish. That allowed them to be able to fill their yield potential. So now we've had very competitive, I'd like to argue, better yields and a lot around the district, without any of the huge input costs as well, which is great. Maintain quality as well, not getting small grain, things like that, and just add so much more resilience into that product as well. And then come through this year, for example, for harvest, started harvest great, and then got hit with 50 mil of rain, which now everyone in the district's suffering from sprouted grain, getting falling numbers and things like that, which, it's really difficult for farmers in the region. Their grain, which ones would have been reasonably good quality, is now going for feed prices and, hurting farmers. But our grain hasn't sprouted at all, and the quality is maintained through that. I'd love to be able to tap into the native grains. It's another little thing I'd love to be able to start trying out. But what I've noticed is by the system working harmoniously with the natural systems, the resilience in the landscape within the grains, has been really quite astounding to be able to witness. And then from a human health perspective, the quality of that product is quite remarkable. And from a taste perspective, it's really quite brilliant.
Now, Stu, let's get practical, because we'd love to sell as much of these, older grains. I know the nutrient profile on native grains, protein more than chicken. You're selling through a local grain miller and baker in Perth as well, but only small quantities. So, Stu, what are you seeing as a way that we can move both these grain operations, scale them up into where the customers, the brewers, we've seen a huge fall down in craft breweries, all falling over in the last couple of years, a lot of them falling over the last couple of years, and then there's been the buyout of those better, Stone and Wood, purchased by the largest, company in the world, largest alcohol company in the world. So we've got this this really vexed issue happening at the moment, in all ways, shapes and sizes, as Jack touched on, with climate change, biodiversity loss, young farmers wanting to come into on the land, all these sort of things. What are you seeing, and how can we practically move forward with your, you've got scale, you've got market share, and you've got a reasonably sized company at the moment?
We do, in the scheme of malting. We're still the smallest maltster in Australia. Australia grows 9 million tonnes of malt grade barley. It's a third of the world's total malt supply comes from Australia. So any beer or whiskey that you drink anywhere around the world, there's a 33% chance it's made entirely with Australian grown grain. We're a very, very, very small operator in the scheme of things, and we supply very niche flavour-driven products to small little craft brewers and distillers. So for us, there's hyper yielding versus native grains. There's a clear winner from our point of view. As I said before, the further we go back, the more unique flavours we can get. One of the challenges that we've had is getting enough of it, and getting it at a price that is a lot of there's some struggles in the craft brewing industry out there at the moment, and the prices that we've had to pay to get small amounts of native grains have been at times 2,000 times the price of commodity based grains. So I think that from my point of view, there's a clear winner in terms of if we're making a choice between native grains or hyper yielding, it's native grains, absolutely. I guess the elephant in the room is how do we grow enough of it to take the place of the 9 million tonnes of malt grade barley that's grown here, and it's probably close to 50 million tonnes when we include the wheat and everything else that's out there. How do we grow enough of it to do that? One comment I would just make: the hyper yielding is certainly isn't the way forward. Barley breeding in particular, and it relates to wheat, but our barley's the malt grade barley is kind of where we work. The yield increases in barley has been phenomenal. What they've been able to do to drive yield is just been off the chart. The plant itself is physically changing. The plant genetics put all its energy into growing grain and not canopy. So you actually, a lot of these hyper yielding varieties need chemical before you even plant that grain. You're basically signing up to 3 or 4 chemical applications because the grains can't compete with other weeds and those kind of things that are in there. Probably doesn't surprise a lot of people that some of these barley breeding companies are actually the chemical companies in disguise that are actually breeding these kind of varieties as well. So. And I'm assuming it happens in every kind of agricultural field. I use the analogy of tomatoes quite a lot. When you go into the supermarket, you can get a tomato off the shelf in Coles and Woolies and bite into it, and it tastes like shit. It tastes like a raw potato. If you've ever grown an heirloom tomato yourself or gone to a farmer's market, they're completely different things. That's the exact same thing that's been happening in grains. We're breeding for processability and yield and all these things that seem great, but it's at the impact of flavour, of soil health, of diversity, of resilience, and so when we started, we were going back to seeds gene banks and resurrecting these old varieties of grains, because the further back we went, the better flavour we were able to get from them, but the better they performed in regenerative farming systems. So look, our biggest issue is getting enough of the native grains and at a price that brewers are actually able to, and distillers are actually able to provide. We provide a unique, I guess we kind of provide two things to brewers and distillers. We provide a very unique product in terms of something that's got a unique flavour profile and something that's quite unique in that regard. But we also provide a story, whether that's the farmer or the way he farms. And native grains kind of just amplifies that a lot, because then you can start bringing cultural heritage and a very unique story that's can talk about our culture and so like it's the question should be, how do we get more?
No, it's not. I mean, that's the challenge, isn't it? Growing a lot of it and having country. The vast majority of arable country is under exotic pasture, right? I mean, there's probably a spot to start. Maybe, can I ask a question? Yeah, good, because I don't want to answer yours. We were told when we were given this brief, this had to be uplifting and humorous. I can give you, to end the conference, that's what we're told. We can do humorous. I guess one of the things in the native food industries, and if we're talking about native grains, is that 2% of the profit proceeds currently go to Aboriginal people. And so, I mean, you've indicated an interest in growing native grains as part of your pasture system, and all power to you, bro. And you've obviously, Stu, used some. Have you got some insights into that? And you sort of talk about the marketability of cultural stories and stuff. Like, there's a value proposition there. strangely enough, and I'll maybe talk a bit to that and how. Yeah, I'm genuinely interested because you see a lot of country is under pretty conventional agriculture, isn't it? I mean, the people in this conference are unusual, right? Are the exception, and so we drive through a stack of country that gets pretty clapped out all the time. And for me, I try not to engage as much as possible in those food systems because they're such a drain on country. But I guess there are different ways of doing it, and I guess there are more equitable ways of doing it as well. So I guess I'm kind of interested in your feelings on that, fellas. Yeah, we're completely off script, I guess.
Yeah, I mean, when it comes to the price point, definitely having quantity helps bring price down, and once it's more acceptable, it kind of creates that, I guess the competition and demand and things like that. Yeah, it works out for a better price point. So to be able to get the native grains into hands of more people to be able to grow it, then yeah, the accessibility for that is much better. And then that works out a win-win for everyone. Obviously, that creates more market drive for that product. More people start using it, and the demand for that goes up, and all of a sudden native grains is a massive part of our food system, which would be great. I'm kind of lost on that one now.
I spoke yesterday in here about paying. So a lot of the farmers that we work with, they dictate the price to us. In the scheme of things, I'm not sure if you bought a beer from the airport recently, but it was only $18 a schooner. Was the price that I paid recently. If we're able to double the price that the farmer gets at their farm gate, that adds an additional 4 cents to that $18 schooner. So in the scheme of things, it's not a hell of a lot. We often will have brewers or distillers come to us and say that we'd love to use your stuff, but it's just a little bit more expensive. And we kind of counter that by saying, well, we'd really love to buy your beer, but it's a little bit more expensive than Carlton Draft. Or well, but it's better beer. Like, well, there you go. Like we've got a quality product here. And in the scheme of things, I like to think that the story that you're able to tell and the better result you're going to get equates to far more than 4 cents. The prices that we've had to pay for native grains have been, and I'm keen to get your take on this, Jack, but we've had a supplier that's been able to get us some grains in the past, but at the moment it seems that a lot of the market and the price of these grains is dictated by mining companies that are using it to revegetate. So we've been told for a while that, look, we expect to pay a lot more for native grains. We know the way they're grown, but there's also a big value proposition there. But 2,000 times the price is kind of a little hard to, for a brewer or distiller to use. And where there is some scope, like I don't expect there to be 100% native grain beers anytime soon, but some of the unique, interesting flavours. The Mitchell grass has this unbelievably strong apricot kind of character that we took through when we malted it. You don't need much of that in a beer to kind of really change it. We also need to be careful though, when we've seen a few instances of this, of some products being released, being called native grain, spirit or whiskey or whatever else, that has had a tokenistic amount in it, and really tried to leverage off the cultural story and those kind of things as well. So there's a lot of opportunity there. Craft beer and spirits operate in that space where people are willing to pay a premium for those products and for a story. And so there is a point where brewers and distillers, craft brewers and distillers are able to absorb that cost or pass that cost on to consumers. At the moment, it is kind of a little, the price probably isn't where it needs to be at the moment for a lot more of that to be happening.
I think what Jack was alluding to, and this is, and maybe this is where we can finish off on a slightly light note, is as you were saying, we've reached this point where, despite last year's, really sad no vote, there's this sort of stuff we have to do together, us white fellas and us and mob, and I know in the conversations I have with so many people and all the aunties that come to the shed, We're really enjoying that challenge. My milling partner is Uncle Cal O'Neill, and he's a Wiradjuri fella, and he's an older fella, and he just loves getting in there and throwing these native grains in and giving them to the chefs. But there's this, and Jack, maybe you can cover this. There's the difference between appreciation and appropriation, and where do we go with that? Because we're hearing 60% of the Australian land mass, could even get up to 80% of the Australian land mass, could be controlled by Indigenous people in the next 10 or 20 years. We've got this failing cropping system, apart from the Dione and Haggertys and all these other people out there. So there's something going on that, but it's at this social level. Where do we acknowledge not just the stories and the cultural wisdom we get from mob, but how do we value that in other ways as well?
Yeah, all the light stuff. Look, I'm not an economist, and I'm not an agriculturalist either. So some of this stuff, the answer to your question is scale, right? Like, I don't think there's any doubt that the issue is scale, and so I guess maybe I'll point to the partnership Black Duck Foods has with Jim at Yambala, in that this was effectively native pasture, wasn't it really? So there are remnant native pastures that are still grazed or lightly grazed or not grazed at all, really, that can help with that price point. I think maybe that comes down to farmers recognising the value in some things that's probably considered trash pasture. There's an opportunity there. But I think in terms of the appropriation versus appreciation, that we do need to get to a point where the opportunities, right, to access that bit of country are shared. Because without that, I don't want to get into the social disadvantage, etc. But in terms of appropriation, the country was appropriated indecently. And we all have a responsibility. I'm an extraordinarily privileged man to own the property that I live on. I'm very aware of that. And we do need to recognise that some people just haven't been given that opportunity through no fault of their own. And it's been entrenched in the system that we're in. God, we're railing against the system this week, aren't we? Far out. But, so I think, we look for scale. There are opportunities for scale. There are native pastures across the country that could help with that scale, but we do need to share the benefit from that, I reckon. Yeah, you've got a good question, have you, Jim?
I want to make a comment that also the native pastures that where this grain's being harvested is the crap bit that no one else wanted. And this country's been on a fat work to destroy native pasture, to put in exotic pasture. And the only places where the native pasture still exists, and that's why you're paying that price, is because no one's actually giving up productive pasture to put in native grain.
Yeah, I think, what I've noticed with what we've done is we're getting a lot of those native grasses and grains come back through naturally throughout, just by changing our practices and restoring that soil ecology. They're coming back of their own accord, so we haven't actually had to plant them, which has been great. Haven't really got around to harvesting them, and that's going to be another challenge in itself. Just the way they're going to thresh through a machine would be different. Might have to ask Jack a bit more on how I go about harvesting the native grains as well. So that adds another thing to it, that we can bring in the native grains from everyone's own landscape. I'm sure the native grains on Jack's landscape would be very different to the west side of the country, which adds another cultural factor. And I know we've got some close relationship with the Indigenous elders from our landscape as well. And there's a massive opportunity for people going down this pathway, whether it's in regenerative growing normal cereal grains or whether they're native grains, to bring in your local Indigenous people to be able to allow them to get back onto country and feel like they're a part of their own landscape once again, and to have diverse businesses across your landscape, whether they come in, they're doing bush tucker things and helping you harvest the native grains and stuff. There's a massive story potential there, and a massive workforce of the Indigenous culture who would love that opportunity to be able to get back out onto the landscape that can really help make the system work, and brings more people into also to the agricultural industry, into those regional communities, and adds an nearly entire new industry in a way.
think socially that it can be quite powerful as well. I mean, I spoke yesterday about beer and spirits being this social lubricant. You don't ever hear bad shit about alcohol. Excise rates trying to curb alcoholic issues and domestic violence and whatever else. In moderation, alcohol is a great social lubricant. It gets people talking. I spoke yesterday at the Regen, here actually on this stage, about putting Regen on a label and having people that have got a beer in their hand and see it, and even if it's 1 in 10,000 people start that conversation. What is it? I remember Tui's new drinking it when I was young, but taking off the twisting off the cap on the top and reading a question underneath. Who was the only Australian cricket player to get sacked after making 100 runs? It was Dizzy Gillespie, a great bowler, but his bowling was rubbish, but made 100 and they sacked him. And then we started the conversation. The conversation then went to what a phenomenal. Remember his first over against Viv Richards, and the whole conversation moved around this word this sentence that we'd read underneath the cap. And we spoke about having regen and how that could prompt the conversation about what is regen farming. The same thing exists for native grains. I've been farming for 4 generations. I had no idea native grains even existed. I was like, what the fuck's native grain? To start having native grain in, I didn't realise it was native grains here. And then, I looked at the local mob were involved in harvesting that grain, and it can be such powerful in terms of yeah.
Good stuff. Right, we'll head out to audience questions. Who wants to kick things off? Yes, Emma Kate. Rose.
So I've got 2 from the mail. Jack, would you be able to tell us the story of Yambara, the farm that you just mentioned before, and also related, but I think one of the things that I'd really like to know from the other 2 is, what sort of protocols are you aware of when you're using this food? Is there any sort of engagement in terms of access to intellectual property, paying the supplier down the line the right amount of money, to benefit the community? So is there a conversation about that happening around the fact that you've discovered native grains in terms of the cultural aspects of the food? Sorry, you might want to just rephrase it.
I think I'm going to need to. Yeah, I can't remember it all. Well, the first question is asking me to tell the story about Yambala, which is not necessarily my story, but I'll have a go. And the other bit of the question was, have you considered? I guess, is it paying a premium on top to assist mob? I guess who's social advantage Yeah. Okay. Yeah. Cultural protocols around use of the. Yeah. Yep. Okay. You've got that. Good. So Yambala is a property that's been in your family 3 generations on the Victoria-New South Wales border. What is it? 80 kilometres inland, 100 kilometres inland, something like that. So Jim, the reason I'm talking about it, so Jim has recently gifted, we just talked about this, 3 titles within that property to an organisation which I'm a part called Back to Country, which was established by Uncle Max Harrison before he passed to ensure that we could continue cultural practice. And that came on the back of us losing access to a couple of properties where we no longer have access to. So Hunk was very keen to have Back to Country as a collective on a title somewhere. So that's the property, but also the original relationship was through Jim and my old man, which I learned today, but there was the opportunity, it has quite a number of species of native grain that the fellas have been able to harvest over 2 or 3 seasons now. Jim, using our sort of custom thresher that gets pulled behind a quad bike and milled with a bit of kit. But that's the story of Yamble. I mean, it's a really significant bit of country. That was part of the songline, the travelling lines for Yuin people up for Bunam, for ceremony in the high country, where many mobs gathered to feast on Bogong Moth. So it's an important bit of country, and there's both tangible and intangible heritage that are right throughout the valley. That's the story.
Do you mind? I don't quite understand the second question completely.
There's a program that one of our colleagues has developed called Growing on Country, and it sort of is for any farmer who wants to engage with First Nations people locally, and it provides them with information around its cultural capability, really, like how do you engage appropriately, I guess. But my question was around, are you aware of the protocols in your local areas about what you can and can't? Because my understanding is that there are certain types of foods that aren't accessible by men or women, or they can't be gathered in by particular groups. Like there's a whole totem system that's in play here. Like how does that affect decision making? And it probably doesn't right now, but how can it affect decision making when you're thinking about growing a new product or accessing a new product?
Yeah, so I mean, us personally, I don't have the experience in doing that. We haven't gone down that pathway as much. But I know with the Indigenous people that we're really close with in our region, if we decide to start growing some of their native species, whether that be fruits or whatever it might be, or grains, on our farm and working together on that, that's where that relationship is built. They bring their knowledge, we bring our farming experience and skills, and we can work together to really build something together. So that's where it's going to be a massive learning curve for us on that part about it, and about respecting their culture as well. But as for specifics, I'm not too sure because we haven't ventured that far yet. You got anything to add?
We haven't malted any native grains for probably 4 or 5 years now. We had some very small samples come through. There wasn't a lot of value we could actually add through the malting process, so we went to some brewers or distillers predominantly that were really keen on using this, and put them directly in contact with the supplier of this grain. A very large distillery went out on country and worked with the mob to harvest a fair bit of Mitchell grass. I think it was close to 6 tonne, which it's got a very low test weight. So it was probably, in terms of the volume, was pretty close to probably the space of this tent. Unfortunately, I wasn't a part of that, but I think that's for me is a really exciting part of native grains, is being able to connect with our local culture and have a reason to learn more about it.
What Emma forgot to mention then was Dom Chen as the person who's developed this Growing on Country. She's a First Nations woman up in Brisbane, did an amazing PhD, and is a pretty powerful Indigenous woman doing really great stuff in giving us white people boundaries and putting structure into how we can move through these relationships. It's she's an amazing woman. More questions? Yes.
Question for you, Jack, if you don't mind. Excuse my ignorance, but you talked for obvious reasons about using native grains in high value niche alcoholic products. I just don't know traditionally what would have been the types and diversity of uses of those native grains. Do you mind talking about that?
Yeah, sure. I mean, for food largely, so mostly unleavened breads, but some, we know that some were using sourdough rising agents. So a lot of them look like things like Johnny cakes, if you know what I'm talking about. So just think scone. But we do know that rising agents were used. I'm not going to go into the specifics because it's not my story to tell. But so Aboriginal people were the first bakers on the planet. It's inarguable. But mainly tucker, it certainly wasn't a major distillery in Australia 300 years ago, but largely for food. And one of the things that my elders have always said, and you talk about bush foods and bush medicines and all that sort of stuff, is that we didn't actually need medicines because our tucker was so healthy. I mean, you alluded to the nutrient profile of our native grains. I mean, it was good gear, right? It's far better than wheat. But yeah, there's an answer, I think.
More questions?
Yes.
This one's for you, Jack, as well. In the context of fire ecology, how would one go about restoring or creating a grassland with native grains?
Right. How would one go from restoring native grasslands or native pastures? I'm assuming from exotic pasture?
No, so a dry eucalypt woodland bordering on dry eucalypt forest, which was heavily logged maybe 100 years ago.
Yep.
How would one, through a fire perspective, think about creating or restoring pockets even of grassland with native grains?
Yep. Thank you for a question in my wheelhouse. Look, there's going to be a million answers to that question. I don't know the country you're talking about, but one of the things we have lost in a lot of forest and woodland countries is an understory, and there's a whole range of reasons for that. Largely, it's about soil quality, but it's also about light. So our woodlands and forests tend to be overcrowded, whether that's through... and look, don't get me wrong, there's a stack of academics who will argue the house down over this, and we maybe don't need to go there today. But and I accept their arguments, and I think at the end of the day, diversity has always been in the landscape. So there was always overcrowded country, but it was a small element in my understanding. But so there's a whole range of things that can mean that our grassy woodlands, or the grass element of our grassy woodlands, disappears, and largely it's overcrowding. So the soils dry out, for instance, because there are too many ukes or shrubby species. The light closes in, and those grass species, which are actually largely used to having quite a large amount of light come through the canopy, get thirsty and suffer from basically being overcrowded. So understanding the prescription means understanding what the problem is. If you think of, Central Highlands, Victoria, or goldfields, for instance, I mean, all of that soil has been turned on its head and largely lost. So there's some really systemic issues with the country in the first place, and we actually have to understand that history to know where to start. Driving through the goldfields can be really challenging in Victoria because you go, Christ, where would you start? But it's probably about slowly and building soil, thinking about how many trees in this area can this country handle in its current state. And we do need to have conversations. When Australians in particular are surveyed about what they appreciate the most in nature, it's trees, and so it's anathema to them to consider that actually there might be too many trees in a patch of forest. It's mind-blown stuff. So it has been easy because of that to drive a conservation narrative that forest and wilderness is the same thing, and it doesn't need to be. So it's understanding the issues behind it. Jason could talk to this beautifully, but the idea is we wouldn't leap in and start burning country until we understood what those issues were. All sorts of things can go wrong. You can actually get a fire, a really hot fire, not wildfire, that will actually drop a suppressing layer of eucalypt leaves on top of the country and stop the next generation of grass coming through. So all sorts of things can go wrong, and that's about observation and working with your bit of country. So I don't have a prescription, but at least you've given me an opportunity to talk about stuff I know about. Thank you.
And I guess that's another opportunity where you can bring in your local Indigenous people who understand your country and be able to use, hopefully they might have some knowledge of their elders' practices for over thousands of years of how they were able to operate cool burning techniques throughout that landscape to create that effect, because Australian landscape's so diverse, it changes every few hundred kilometres. So yeah, you really need to try and find somewhere in your local area, and that brings them more involved, and I'm sure they'd appreciate that opportunity.
More questions? We're out of questions, are we?
We've basically got 5 minutes, and then...
And then... Rightio, great. Well, one last little quick question, yeah. Oh, yeah. You sure? Yeah.
I guess I'm wondering about mechanisms, like it's similar to the question that I asked before. How it seems like how do Indigenous people benefit from how can they go into the future benefit more from the intellectual property stuff without, and have control over their intellectual property, while at the same time kind of acknowledging that the growth of their culture into the European culture by taking the brakes off. So, for instance, if the Haggertys could just, without thinking about, just grow heaps of native grains without giving any compensation, that might, in general, if there's a wider that across the country in terms of, without not having to get permission to use language and all those kinds of things, it could really speed the Indigenous culture kind of having an effect on the landscape and on Australian culture through kind of getting it out there and having changing the European culture. Whereas by doing that, just by taking the brakes off, obviously we can't do that, it's hypothetical, but by taking the brakes off like that, you'd also limit potentially the immediate control and benefit to Indigenous communities, that infringe on their property rights, intellectual property rights effectively. So it's a question to all of you.
Oh, that's a quick question. So it's really about this entangled land rights, property rights, plant breeders' rights, and how that translates across to Indigenous peoples.
Yeah, so you're kind of saying that if we kind of look past the culture aspects and just take the foot off that part and just let us grow what we can, that might actually speed the process up, and then we can bring the cultural appropriation back a little bit. Is that?
Potentially, or that even having those grades taken up by current Australian people as a whole, having those grades integrated in our culture, having more Indigenous language integrated across our culture, having more Indigenous practices integrated across our whole landscape, across our culture, is kind of like a bigger impact of Indigenous culture on the present, on the landscape, and on Australia. So,
Yeah, I mean, it'd definitely be great. I guess it's trying to get that on a large scale and getting that across the whole landscape, I think is going to be the challenging part. We could easily kind of let our property just go do your native stuff, and that'd be a great, I guess centerpiece for people to view at. But then we won't be productive on a food producing scale as well. Yeah.
If I understand the question, I know we don't have a lot of time. One of the things I think we do cart before the horse stuff a little bit, and maybe that's the trouble with this panel's proposition, is around we're not having a go. I think it's been a great yarn, but is that we're leaping to the potential solution, right? But I don't think as a community we're talking about the major issue. And that is that as a society, we're not benefit sharing. And I mean that black, white and brindle. I don't mean to be on my high horse. I actually think as a community, we need to sort this out. And so I think some of the wonderful things we've heard, about questioning what ownership means and should mean, and taking things from Indigenous culture that have already been shared, things like, respect for the earth, as if it's a relation. It seems almost in our society trite to say these things, right? But in fact, if you think about it and just go, well, I have a relationship to the land, and farmers have a relationship to the land. People in the cities don't, or they don't understand their relationship and the responsibility that comes with it, because of course they have a relationship. They're still eating bread, right? They're still eating beef. But I think they're the principles that I think can help us, and then maybe things flow from there,
It's a great note. I remember my first conversation with Bruce when he came up to the Food Connect shed, and we were dealing with this challenge. Food Connect had never sold any First Nations food, and I was continually going up to elders everywhere where I can to say, made my pitch. We're good people, we want to do the right thing, but we're not going to do it until we've been given permission. and I'd never get a reply. And this 10 years later, Bruce is in the shed and a whole bunch of other Indigenous people, and I elbowed Emma and I said, I'm going to do this pitch again. And I gave my big bloody holy moral story about, you know, how good we'd been, and they all just laughed and said, of course you bloody can, you know, like what, you know, it was just the funniest thing. But then we went into a really serious conversation, because First Nations epistemology is always about obligation and reciprocity, not accountability and responsibility. So they're always, they don't want to tell you what you should do. It should come out of your own volition, and then you come forward. So Bruce and I had, and the rest of them had this really deep conversation, interesting conversation about if we could design courses that farmers could do out of their own volition to learn about cultural stuff, and then out of their own volition they would do the right thing and stand upright in the world, in their P&L and in their balance sheet, and say yes, like you've done. And I think that's the sort of, this is the missing piece. We're trying to talk to a culture who talks a completely different language epistemologically, and it's just so fundamentally, we just have to go, yes, it's a different culture, and their culture and their wisdom and their sophistication is incredibly nuanced around our potential as human beings. And I can't say any more than that. But anyway, let's thank the panel. Cheers.